I think Alberta had probably the worst 4 years since the Great Depression. And it was about as long as the Great Depression. And unfortunately, it continues. While other oil patches around North America, Texas, North Dakota, have fully rebounded, I don't actually think it's over for Alberta yet, this recession, this divestment of investors.
No, I mean, we've seen that, right? We've seen Encana, we've seen Husky, we've seen all sorts of other resource companies either move or certainly lay off people. Several of the big companies have also announced that they are going to put a cap on their drilling activity for the year. Others are going ahead. And I think there are some signs that things will be better under a UCP government than they were under the NDP government. But boy, there was a big pin popped Alberta's balloon on October 21st when the Liberals won minority re-election, largely based out of Greater Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, because those are the three most anti-Alberta areas in the country. And so the Liberals have to pander to those areas of the country, plus to the NDP and the Greens to keep them in power. And, you know, people in the oil business aren't stupid. They know what that means for their industry.
Yeah. I think one of the things that irks Westerners, and I regard myself as sort of a spiritual Westerner, even though I've been out east for many years now, is that so many Liberal candidates, and even Trudeau himself, felt free to disparage Alberta and the oil patch to their voter base out east. And even the fact that they handpicked a star candidate, Stephen Guilbeault, the head of Equiterre, which is like the David Suzuki Foundation of Quebec, and they appointed him to cabinet immediately. You had all these other Liberal MPs who had just served 4 years. No way, this new guy goes straight to the front. Now, they didn't put him in environment, but he's in cabinet and he'll have his say on environmental issues for sure. I think that what's different, what's worse, is how Trudeau publicly demonized Alberta and didn't care that we knew. That was sort of, yeah, that's the point here. I'm trying to shore up the antipathy towards Alberta and big, rich oil companies. They actually demonized those companies.
Yeah. Well, and look at Catherine McKinnon, who had been the environment minister until the election. I mean, she talked all the time about having to go after big oil, and the oil companies are so awful, and we're going to keep an eye on those oil companies. And it became tedious. And maybe that doesn't sound like much to people who live outside of a resource region. It's just political pandering. It's posturing by some politician, some candidate, some minister. But boy, when they're going after the industry that keeps your region alive, actually keeps much of the country going too, even though the rest of the country might not understand that all the time. When they're going after that industry and you know it's closely attached to how your region fares, you take that personally. And why wouldn't you take that personally? If you started to talk about, no, we have to cut down on hydroelectric transfers to the United States, or we have to cut back on asbestos exports, or we have to do you think the people in Quebec would not understand what you're talking about?
Yeah.
And that's exactly what, even when they weren't mentioning Alberta by name, Albertans understood what they were talking about. And it was clear, like it had been in 1980. In 1980, the federal election, Clark had miscalculated with his minority government. The Liberals had cleverly stacked the Commons one night, forced a new election. Now they're running to try and regain their majority. And the motto inside the Liberal war room in 1980 was, screw the West, we'll take the rest.
Yeah.
And at that time, Vancouver would still vote Conservative. So you didn't get a single Liberal seat outside of Winnipeg in the entire west of the country. And this time around, they weren't quite as clever. They didn't have a motto like that, but it was very obvious that they had decided there were no votes for them to be had in Alberta, Saskatchewan, the interior BC. So they wouldn't care what they said about those regions. They were pandering to the Greater Toronto Area, to Montreal, Ottawa, that Golden Triangle, and then to the core areas of Vancouver. And that won for them. At least it preserved them from having a loss. They only won a minority, of course, but they kept they kept their power because, in part, because of slamming the oil industry, and indirectly by slamming Alberta and Saskatchewan.
That's an excerpt from the Ezra Levant Show, which is a show I do every day. I do a monologue, interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. But you've got to subscribe to it, which you can do at premium.rebelnews.com.